in August of 2005, when Hurricane Katrina happened in New Orleans, I was Associate Professor Research at the LSU Hurricane Center in Baton Rouge, where I was studying the aerodynamic behavior of windborne debris. At that point, I had been involved in wind engineering research while teaching architecture for about 25 years. So I was fielding the media calls, and the reporters asked me to join them in New Orleans to go through the streets with them in a boat to help them interpret what they were seeing. Because the flood was still very high, we launched off the exit ramp off the elevated highway and boated through the silent streets. It was so eerie. The streets were all turned into waterways. The cars and the buildings were underwater. We decided to drive through the McDonald's drive-through. It was surreal. But it was also heart-wrenching when we saw how people trapped in their attics had to escape the rising water by chopping their way with axes out through the attic. We rescued 2 dogs stranded on a porch, and I put them in my car and drove them back to Baton Rouge with me. After the water went down, I went back as part of the Hurricane Center's reconnaissance team to observe and document the wind damage. But obviously, it was the water and not the wind that had impacted people the most. It was so bad in the lower Ninth Ward that they blocked off the streets for months, and nobody without official credentials could even get in. When they finally let the residents back in to go to their houses to see if there was anything left they could salvage, the combination of super high heat and humidity had destroyed everything. Even the houses themselves were rotting. Anything inside that hadn't been stolen by vandals was covered with black mold. Of all my experiences after Hurricane Katrina, it was the conversations with the survivors that were the hardest. And their stories of terrible loss still haunt and inspire me. Yes, they lost their homes, but that wasn't the worst of it. They lost their communities, their networks, their support systems, their very way of life. The kinship links in the lower Ninth Ward ran deep. Family gatherings of 200 or more, once common, were no longer possible. Large families had been separated and evacuated in all directions. Houston, Atlanta, Baltimore, Nebraska, you name it. Most people couldn't even come back home because their homes were unlivable. And they had no resources to live somewhere else while they were trying to repair their houses. The utilities hadn't been turned back on, and without hookups, they couldn't get FEMA trailers. It was more than a year before the electricity was restored to most of the lower Ninth Ward, making it almost impossible for people to return and reestablish their lives. FEMA's solution: permanently elevate your house or else move away. The cost of Hurricane Katrina had been estimated at $125 billion, and that only accounts for the material damage. The human costs are ignored in that estimate. Communities were dispersed, social networks were broken, children's educations were interrupted. More than 1,600 people died. Families lost everything. People were traumatized. People committed suicide. There had to be a better way so that the homes weren't damaged and people could move right back in after the flood and stay in their communities and continue to live their lives without such disruption. So, what if the houses could get out of the way of the flood? Well, I'm an academic, so I started doing research. And what did I find? I found there were traditional communities in flood-prone regions that for hundreds of years had been floating their houses. In Thailand, for example, there were places where people used to put bundles of bamboo under the houses so that they would be like rafts. When the rains came, they tied them to trees so that they could float up and then settle back down without floating away. I call these houses amphibious because they live happily both on the land and on the water. I don't call them floating. They're not houseboats. They're not floating most of the time, only when there's a flood. We can see, for example, in the Netherlands, here's an amphibious house, both when it's dry and when it's floating. And then I discovered from my LSU students that we already had amphibious homes in Louisiana, in nearby Old River Landing, a rural fishing community on a lake alongside the Mississippi River. So we went there to see what they were doing. And shortly thereafter, we completed our first amphibious prototype at LSU. We constructed a temporary flood wall around it and filled the tank with water, and it floated. Oh, I was so thrilled. So then we loaded the structure with barrels full of water to simulate the weight of an actual house. It still floated. So then we added sandbags to create the weight of the appliances and the furniture and people walking around in the house. We even took all the sandbags and put them on one side of the house to see how much it would tilt. It was still stable. And finally, we loaded it with simulation of high winds and water currents, and it was just fine. It really worked. Amphibious houses float by the same simple physics principles that float the rubber ducky in your bathtub. We add vertical guidance posts to keep the house from going anywhere except straight up and down. They're anchored in the ground, and they resist the horizontal forces from the wind and fast-flowing water. So despite the fact that we, with our prototype, had demonstrated proof of concept, FEMA still had concerns that amphibious housing would encourage new development in flood zones. So therefore, they banned amphibious construction, making it difficult for us to get any funding or to persuade the local communities to support our project. By this time, I had moved from LSU to the University of Waterloo in Canada, where I teach today. And for several years after that, I spent my time designing unbuilt projects, building small-scale models, and creating renders and animations with the help of my architecture students there. I got my first major grant in 2016. It was funding to create amphibious retrofit prototypes for existing houses for rice farmers in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. In the summer of 2018, we finished 4 of these prototypes, using different combinations of the elements that make up a buoyant foundation. I varied the materials used for buoyancy, and I varied the sleeves that connect the houses to the vertical guidance posts. Each of the 4 prototypes is different. Our goal was to create a flexible amphibious prototype, retrofit prototype, that would be economically feasible for Vietnam's very low-income rice farmers, and in the process, to teach them how to do it themselves. There are families living in these houses today, and best of all, when the monsoon floods arrived, they all floated beautifully. And now all their neighbors want us to retrofit their houses too. So to do that, what we need now is a scaling up grant so that we can create more of these for other communities across Southeast Asia and other vulnerable places in the world, so that people are empowered to take their futures into their own hands. And we need to customize the solutions to fit the specific needs of each community by utilizing inexpensive, locally available materials. For instance, in a project that we developed for Nicaragua, we designed decks to go around the houses, so that the people didn't have to take their pigs and chickens inside the house with them, because otherwise they wouldn't have had any place else to keep the animals safe. In a project that we're working on now for First Nations reserves in northern Canada, in order to accommodate the increased flooding due to climate change, we have winter to consider, all the snow and ice, and the effects of the expansion and contraction from the freezing and thawing. And while we work in different cultures and local conditions around the world, we all have a common goal: to benefit people in need while working in sympathy with nature, by letting the water become our friend, who is actually lifting us to safety above the flood. Flooding is a global concern. The benefits of amphibious housing can be realized worldwide to mitigate displacement, loss, and trauma. And together we can transform the lives of people in flood zones from living in fear to living in harmony with water. Thank you.